Going into the mid-1930s, Swiss planners were able to read the tea leaves fairly accurately and realized that a fresh new war in Europe was increasingly likely, so they set out to upgrade their single-engined aircraft fleet, which at the time was still made up mostly of biplanes from the 1920s. They solicited designs and ended up with two options: a modernized biplane called the C-35 and a low-wing monoplane called the C-36. The C-35 was seen as low risk and easy to get into production quickly, so an order was placed almost immediately after the design was finalized. However, while the monoplane C-36 design was considered basically ready, the Swiss figured that it might just take too long to ramp up production, and it may end up being too expensive. So they looked into options for buying foreign planes, including the Bf-110, which they considered to be a fairly good match for their needs. Those efforts didn't really pan out though, so they opted to go with the C-36. The prototype flew for the first time in 1939 and actually had a fairly smooth development process. Since the design itself had been pretty close to finished years earlier, the design engineers had time to brainstorm and work out a lot of the potential problems in advance. However, the Swiss aviation industry wasn't very well funded, and the actual construction work was pretty slow, with only low-rate production being possible. The C-36 was generally produced in batches over two main variants: the 3603 combat and observation plane, and the 3604 patrol interceptor. Most C-36s built were the 3603, but about a dozen of the upgraded 3604s saw service with additional cannons and a more powerful engine. The C-36 family went on to serve as a trainer and a target tug long after its utility as a combat aircraft had passed, and the last one wasn't retired until the late 1980s. As a bonus, here are a couple of pictures I took of the turboprop-powered C-3605 at the Speyer Technical Museum in Germany. This was an upgrade to some low-hour airframes to graft in a turboprop engine and extend the lifespan, but the example at Speyer here is in pretty poor condition. What we get in War Thunder is the C-3604, a strike aircraft in Rank 2 of the German tech tree at battle rating 2.7. This plane has, frankly, some pretty absurd forward firepower for Rank 2. It gets three 20mm cannons of two different types, and a pair of low-caliber machine guns. Oh, and it's got a gun turret on the back with another pair of machine guns. Notably, the cannons have really severe ballistic drop, and I personally find them pretty difficult to aim, so you might want to practice with them a bit. You get a fairly generous supply of ammo for all of the guns, and my usual preference is the air targets belt for the cannons and the universal for the machine guns. But it's worth noting that the ground target belts for the cannons actually have pretty good armor penetration for this BR, and they're quite capable of taking out light or medium tanks. For loadouts, the 3604 can take two different sizes of dumb bombs or a couple of racks worth of unguided rockets. More on that later. The flight performance of the 3604 is kinda weird. Its weight is somewhere in between a single engine and a twin engine plane, but it's only got one engine of average power. Overall, it's fairly slow, and its low-speed acceleration is particularly bad, which can become a bit of an issue in dogfights. The rate of climb feels generally average, but despite getting an air spawn, some single-engine fighters coming off the runway can still beat it up to altitude. Add to this, the stability and rudder response really just aren't very good either, and the rudder's almost useless at low speeds. You can see a couple of times in the clips where I was in relatively good position for a point-blank shot in air combat, but I couldn't get the last couple of degrees out of the rudder at low speed, and the target slipped past as I just wobbled along waiting for engine power that never arrived. There are some strengths to the plane though. First, it's got a huge wing area and it turns very well at high to medium speeds. If you can get into position for a flat turn in on an opponent, you can usually get an angle on them in only one maneuver. But the weak rudder makes fine aiming adjustments pretty difficult, especially combined with the ballistic drop of the cannons. Now, the combat flaps are safe to throw out at basically any realistic airspeed, and they give a noticeable increase to the turn performance, which is already good, but this comes at a cost. A very high cost, actually, which is generally this plane's big weakness: poor energy retention. This is kind of a heavy plane, and even without the flaps, it drains airspeed badly in sustained turns. And while you can easily turn with lighter fighters for the first part of an engagement, you can't maintain that level of agility. The flaps become a double-edged sword, as you can maintain the good performance a little bit longer, or cut in a little bit harder at the start, but once it starts to fall off, you're even slower, and it's significantly more difficult to get your airspeed back. Kind of a high-risk, high-reward situation, and I tried to include footage that demonstrated this pretty clearly. The other real strong point of this plane is its literal strength. This thing is really pretty tanky, and sometimes it can absorb a lot of damage before it goes down. When you take this plane up into air battles, you get an air spawn in RB, which can help considerably, especially with its kind of marginal climb rate. You can get to the bombers much of the time if you take minimum fuel and no external weapons and do a side climb, but if you get intercepted by an enemy plane, it's very likely that they're going to catch you in a pretty low energy state. Now, even if you abort your climb when you see them coming in, the acceleration on the 3604 just isn't as good as a lot of the other single-engine fighters, and you'll usually be at a disadvantage for the opening maneuver in those kind of engagements where somebody catches you climbing. Now, in an ideal scenario, you can use this plane for some really great boom and zoom stuff, but it's highly vulnerable to last-second jinking moves, and it can be pretty difficult to make fine adjustments to your aim on the way in. For traditional turn fighting, as I alluded a minute ago, you can do really well for one or two maneuvers at high speeds, especially with the combat flaps, and you can really get some pretty impressive turn performance out of this thing. But it's going to bleed energy so bad, you might have to abort the fight if it goes on for too long. Now, if that happens, don't hesitate to just fly straight and switch back into your gunner view to try and unload on the guy following you. Sometimes it actually works pretty well as kind of a poor man's reverse energy trap. Just remember the limited field of fire for the gunner. Something this plane really excels at, though, is head-on attacks. The forward firepower on the 3604 is just insane for Rank 2, and a lot of players will still try full commit head-ons in this BR bracket. And if you don't mind potentially absorbing a couple of hits on the way through, you can usually win most of those head-on attacks. I swear, man, players in War Thunder just never learn how stupid of a tactic full commit head-ons are, so when you see them coming at you in this plane, just accept the engagement and hold the trigger. Now, in terms of ground attack, the limited weapon load holds the plane back in air battles a bit. However, the cannons and rockets can both be pretty effective in close air support. I had a really good time using this plane up over a ground battle, despite its limitations. Visually, the 3D model is very well done, and I couldn't find any obvious problems. The Swiss paint job on it is pretty unique with the huge markings and all that, but if I'm being honest, I think the 3604 is kind of funny looking and really just a bit of an eyesore. It might still grow on you, though. Landing this one is pretty easy. The gear can go out at around 300 kilometers an hour, and the flaps can drop at around 270. Just keep the low engine power in mind, and ride the throttle until it's safe to touch down. Very low risk of noseovers, so lock up the brakes as soon as you can. The cockpit has pretty good visibility out in front and off to the sides, and the instruments are all really easy to find. I did have a little trouble with the gun sight, but if you set the machine guns to the stealth belt, it'll be much easier. Overall, it's an okay cockpit. To close out on the C-3604. This plane has absurd forward firepower. Its rear gunner is actually useful, and it has great turn performance. However, it's a bit slow, it bleeds energy like a stuck pig, and its external weapon selection is very limited. The final verdict on the 3604 is that this is a fun addition to the German tech tree, providing a little bit of variety along with some really solid potential for close air support. As always, thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, check out this next one.